Hi, I'm Jon Pitt. I am an assistant professor in the East Asian Studies Department at the University of California, Irvine.
And I'm Alyse Larkin. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Earth System Science at the University of California, Irvine.
And so with my research, what I look at is modern writers and filmmakers from Japan who think about and write about and film plant life in really interesting ways. And so what I am thinking about in these works is how they rethink what it means to be human through plant life. So at these different moments in Japanese history, the writers and the filmmakers that I look at in my research are thinking about how to respond to moments of crisis, upheaval, right? By imagining what it might be like to become more like plants, right? So we can think about how plants are able to withstand and adapt to all kinds of changes, environmental changes, right? They wilt, they lose their leaves in the winter, they come back, regrow, come back to life in the spring. Anybody who has a garden knows how tenacious, certain weeds can be, right? And so I like to look at novels and poems and films that, are all kind of questioning what would it be like, right, if humans were able to be more plant-like in that way, right? And what if humans were actually not as different from plants as we kind of conventionally think they are? I'm also producing a podcast at the moment, and the first season is all about the ocean and about how different scholars within these Japan studies think about and write about the ocean.
I examine microorganisms across broad environmental, both spatial and temporal scales in the ocean. So specifically looking at Prochlorococcus, which is the world's most abundant photosynthetic organism. It grows at up to 10 to the fifth cells per mil and is incredibly important in terms of producing a large percentage of the world's oxygen. Moreover, Prochlorococcus is highly diverse. And so we can use Prochlorococcus as basically ecogenomic biosensors of environmental change.
So it's really fascinating. How did you even figure out that this is what you wanted to devote your research to?
Yeah, so this is so cliche, right, for all marine biologists, but I've always loved the ocean. I grew up in Los Angeles, and sort of my inspiration started in high school. My high school bio class would go down to the Zuma Beach actually every Thursday, and we'd identify everything we could see there. And then our teacher would send out a kid on a surfboard who would do a plankton tow, and we would count and identify all of the phytoplankton and zooplankton. And so from there, my interest kind of really focused in on these microorganisms, because it's just fascinating to me that something so small can have such a global biogeochemical impact. And so how can these tiny microorganisms, Prochlorococcus, it's really hard to visualize exactly how small it is, but for reference, one of the largest phytoplankton is Trichodesmium, which is, I think, maybe about, you can sometimes see it with the naked eye. It's about maximum, I think, like a millimeter in size. Compared to Trichodesmium, if you think of Trichodesmium as the island of Manhattan, Prochlorococcus would be a fish in comparative size. So Prochlorococcus is tiny, but 1 in every 10 breaths we take is thanks to Prochlorococcus. And so, basically I wanted to learn about how we can use these microorganisms to inform us of processes like climate change, because we know they're so important for the ocean, both in terms of producing oxygen, but also sequestering carbon. How can we use them to inform our understanding of these global processes? And that question of scale was probably the most fascinating to me.
I do see a connection between what you're saying, in that you are talking about how, these very obscure, very small things that we can't see, right, actually have this very large impact on, our life, the way we live, the oxygen we breathe. And so kind of on a different, maybe a different scale, right? I, I was drawn to works of literature where it seems like there's things happening in the background, right, that are not so obvious, but are having a kind of profound impact on actually what's taking place, right? And so I entered graduate school knowing I wanted to work on Japanese literature, and film as well. And I kind of had this vague idea when I started graduate school that I wanted to study the supernatural, right? There's this long tradition within Japanese literature of the supernatural. And somewhere along the line, I started to realize, actually, if you focus in on the natural, it's just as bizarre or confusing or, not really understood, maybe even more so, right, than the way we think about the supernatural in literature. And so that made me start to kind of look for these moments in novels and films where the sort of background of the story, the setting, all the things that are kind of happening outside the human character's consciousness, right? All of that stuff in the background seemed really interesting to me, and so plant life seemed like a really easy way to kind of get at that, right? um, Plants are really ubiquitous, right, in so much literature, so many films, but they're often just kind of seen as background, right, to the action. And so, yeah, I think the aha moment for me was just to think, well, what if we actually kind of decentered the human a little bit, right? And started focusing in on, all these plants and things in the background.
I think that's something that also really resonated with me in sort of trying to think about sort of the connections between your work and my work. It was really interesting to me that your sort of subjects were processing the world through a plant-like view, basically, or trying to use the perspectives of plants to process the world. And I think that's something, that is fundamentally scientific, and especially, in biology, that's something that I think in my line of work can push something from just sort of basic science to really great science if scientists can try and wrap their mind around, okay, what is the world from the perspective of a microbe,
Mm.
right? So that, sort of through line between what you're working on and sort of what I think about was very clear to me.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that actually, because that's one of the things I find so exciting and pleasurable, really, in the work that I do, is to see how these different writers. I mean, really from a long stretch of time, you know, they're all sort of, like I said, responding to all these different moments. But one of the things that they keep doing is coming back to plant life and really doing this almost phenomenological experiment, right? Where they're trying to think about, okay, how do plants experience the world? There's something very poetic, literary about that to me, right? So I was wondering, for someone who is a scientist who has a very particular language, right? Reading your work is really fun and challenging because the language is just so specialized and so different. And I think those of us in the humanities often think that science is not the kind of place where you can engage with that sort of speculative phenomenological experiments that I'm talking about. But it sounds like that is something you do, maybe not in your published work, but at least maybe on a day-to-day basis, right? Is kind of try to imagine what the world feels like for these microorganisms.
Yeah, there is kind of a disconnect there. I mean, to a certain degree, I think good science requires a great deal of creativity
Hmm.
and originality. And some of the best ways to get there is to try and pull upon ideas and theories and frameworks from across different systems. Um, but that largely happens outside of the publication realm. Yeah.
But that actually makes me think of something that I felt really strongly when I was reading your work. And this is kind of thinking about some of these perceived differences between the humanities and the sciences, right? I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, right? In my own writing sometimes, where I will, stage this thing that's happening, right, between the scientific view of the world versus a kind of more artistic or philosophical view of the world, right? Whereas, the sort of stereotype is that, the scientific view of the world, the scientific lens in which you look at life, renders it quantifiable, measurable, right? It kind of takes the ambiguity, the life, the joy, the art out of the world, right? But again, reading your work, it's a good reminder that that's really just kind of a gross overgeneralization of what the sciences do, right? And that there is a greater kind of overlap between the way in which we acknowledge our limits of being able to know, right, in the humanities and in the sciences, and that kind of ambiguity, I think, fuels both types of research.
I think the ambiguity is, like you're saying, it's definitely a good thing.
Mhm.
And reading your work, that reminded me, because sometimes I think in science we can get so focused on the details, right?
Mhm.
um, and so even though I've been saying, it's important to think about um, the world from Prochlorococcus's viewpoint, reading your work reminded me of that, right? And so I think that's where, reminding oneself of sort of the art in science is a really strong and good exercise to do. Like, oh yeah, like it is important to think about it from their perspective. One thing I was thinking about was how, so sort of coming back to your work and using sort of plants and science to deal with trauma. I was thinking about how, science is comforting in some ways, right? Because it's very controlled, right? You're focusing
Mhm.
on a very specific, controlled part of the world, part of our universe, right?
Right, right.
But if you just focus on that, then you can miss the trauma that science or the scientific field or academia can inflict on other people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's one thing where I think also interdisciplinary conversations can help, right? I think scientists might not be very good at having these conversations, but I think if we can really get better at both communicating our science but also communicating with each other in a really human way, either through things like podcast or through outreach to underserved communities and being actively anti-racist. I think it's becoming more and more important to have those types of conversations, and these sort of interdisciplinary conversations are a place where that can come out for sure.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think you put that so well. And I'll just add that I think, specifically the ocean becomes this place where, a lot of that kind of reaching beyond our disciplinary boundaries and borders, it becomes a place where that's very possible. I think the more interdisciplinary conversations across the STEM humanities boundary, that are possible, I mean, the better for everybody, for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's been fascinating talking to you, wonderful talking to you, and I look forward to reading more of your work and trying to better understand the microbes. So,
Yeah, I have to say I really enjoyed reading the chapters of your book. I was I was an environmental studies major
mm,
as an undergrad, focusing on anthropology and biology. And so it really sort of elicited a lot of memories of taking classes about native populations in the environment and environmental feminism and all of these different concepts. And so I really enjoyed reading it and really enjoyed the opportunity to remind myself the sort of importance of embracing the human aspect of science and of understanding the world and using that to improve science. So thank you for sending that my way. I really enjoyed the opportunity to chat. This has
Oh,
been a great experience.
it's been wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right.
Bye.